Usually, when we talk about a blueprint, there is this expectation of, absolute uncompromising precision.
Right, like it has to be perfect.
Exactly. You look at an architectural schematic, and it points to a very specific reality. Like, there's the load-bearing wall, there is the plumbing, there is the electrical grid.
Wood, nails, steel, concrete.
Yeah, it's totally binary. The wall either holds the weight of the roof, or, well, the building collapses.
And, that kind of visible, categorized structure provides a massive amount of comfort for us. We just crave instructions that guarantee a specific, predictable result.
Yeah.
If you follow steps A through D, you get a functioning house.
But then you step out of that realm of physical engineering and, into the landscape of the human experience.
Oh, yeah. That's where it gets messy.
Right. You try to map out human psychology or emotional growth or even just the way we process trauma and construct narratives. And suddenly, that rigid binary blueprint seems, well, entirely useless.
Golly.
You're standing in a landscape that is just murky, contradictory, and deeply confusing.
We're talking about the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters here. Human behavior just doesn't follow a straight line. And our emotional responses, they certainly don't adhere to some simple schematic.
Which is why the premise we are unpacking today is so staggering, because what if there actually is a blueprint for that murky landscape?
A map for the chaos.
Exactly, a map that navigates the chaos of human growth. So our source material today is Christopher Vogler's highly influential book, The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers, 3rd edition.
Such a landmark text.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to take this text and explore what is arguably the ultimate blueprint of storytelling, which is the hero's journey. But we're going to push far beyond the idea of this being just a cheat sheet for Hollywood screenwriters trying to construct a summer blockbuster.
Right, because it's so much more than that.
Way more. We're going to uncover how this framework is actually a profound, almost secret instruction manual for the human experience itself.
Framing it as an instruction manual for the human experience, that cuts right to the heart of Vogler's work.
Yeah.
Yeah. The core premise here relies heavily on the depth psychology of Carl Jung and, the mythological studies of Joseph Campbell. The argument is that myths, legends, and stories are not just these arbitrary tales we invented to pass the time around a campfire.
Right, they aren't just entertainment.
Exactly. They are the collective dreams of humanity. They follow universal, recurring patterns across completely disconnected cultures. And they do that because those patterns reflect the biological and psychological hardwiring of the human mind itself.
Wow.
Like the organs of our bodies, our central nervous systems, our deep subconscious, they all operate on and respond to this specific narrative rhythm.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if I'm hearing this correctly, you are saying that these ancient mythic tools like structures that were formalized long before the pyramids were built or Stonehenge was erected, they are actively dictating the mechanics of the movies we stream on a Friday night.
Yes, the movies, the novels we read, everything.
And even the deeply personal struggles we face in our daily lives.
Absolutely.
So by the time we finish exploring these sources, you, listening to us right now, should possess an entirely new edge. You will be able to deconstruct your favorite film, sure, but more importantly, you'll be able to look at the chaotic trajectory of your own life, your career, your relationships, and pinpoint exactly where you are on the map.
But to trust that map, we have to look at the crucible, where Vogler actually tested these theories. Because he didn't just sit in an academic ivory tower writing papers about Carl Jung.
Right.
He took these ancient mythological concepts into one of the most ruthless, high-stakes laboratories on the planet, which is the modern Hollywood studio system. Specifically, he worked as development executive for the Fox 2000 feature film label.
Which means he is operating far beyond the realm of, animated fairy tales or simple children's fables.
Oh, definitely.
He's stepping into the deep end of complex, live-action, adult-oriented cinema.
Yeah, at Fox 2000, Vogler was tasked with analyzing and developing massive big-budget films. We're talking about Fight Club, The Thin Red Line, Courage Under Fire.
Wow, those are heavy hitters.
Exactly. And this is an environment that runs on fierce intensity and, honestly, financial terror. Every single concept, every script revision, every structural suggestion has to pass the most rigorous, unforgiving tests of logic and show business instinct.
Because millions of dollars are on the line.
Millions.
Oh.
Vogler describes the atmosphere in those executive meeting rooms as places where power flows like hot lava.
That is quite the image.
Right. You are standing hip deep in it, and if you make a misstep, you are burned alive professionally. So if these mythological concepts were just academic fluff or soft theoretical musings, they would have been instantly incinerated in that room.
But they weren't.
No, they weren't. They formed the backbone of incredibly successful, culturally defining films.
And the text highlights a specific metric Vogler used to know these ancient rules were working in that modern environment. And it's fascinating because it bypasses the intellect completely. It's a concept of the book called The Wisdom of the Body.
Yeah, Vogler realized that in that high-pressure laboratory, the intellect is actually a very poor judge of a story's underlying truth.
Really?
Yeah, like a script might have brilliant, witty dialogue and a really clever plot, but if it only engages the logical brain, it will leave a mass audience completely cold.
So what is the actual judge then?
The only true, undeniable judge of a story's effectiveness is a physiological reaction. If reading a script or watching a rough cut didn't literally make his throat tighten, or his heart race, or his lungs pump faster,
Oh, wow.
if it didn't induce an involuntary physical response like tears or a sudden explosion of laughter, the structure was failing.
That makes so much sense.
Right. The hero's journey works across cultures and generations specifically because it bypasses the frontal lobe and acts directly on the body's nervous system.
And applying those ancient, visceral rules to the highly technical, modern process of filmmaking yields some brilliant analogies in the text. Like, Vogler compares the process of editing a film to the construction of a Viking dragon ship.
I love that analogy. The visual of the Viking ship perfectly captures the balance between underlying structure and outward detail.
Yeah, so you start with the spine of the story, which acts as the keel of the ship. That massive, solid, foundational beam that cuts directly through the water, because without the keel, the ship immediately capsizes.
It just rolls right over.
Exactly. Then the major plot points act as the ribs curving upward from the keel, giving the vessel its shape and structural integrity. And finally, the individual scenes, the character quirks, and the lines of dialogue are the planks and the rigging that complete the outer shell.
Right, the stuff you actually see.
Yeah. But the ultimate lesson of the editing room isn't about what you add, it's about what you have discipline about.
That's the hardest part for any writer.
It really is. By removing diffuse elements like the unnecessary pauses, the clunky expositional scenes, the beautiful but totally pointless dialogue. You sharpen the spotlight on the load-bearing ribs, you make the ship sleeker, faster, and way more dangerous.
But doing that requires a foundational understanding of which rib is actually load-bearing and which is just decorative.
True.
But where this philosophy becomes truly radical is how it applies outside the safety of the editing room.
Yeah.
Like out in the real world when you're facing actual professional hostility. The text details this remarkable personal anecdote from Vogler's early career regarding a public attack.
Oh, the confrontation over the Willow memo. This is the perfect stress test for the entire theory.
It really is. So, early in his career, while working at Disney, Vogler wrote a now legendary 7-page memo summarizing the hero's journey for studio executives.
Just 7 pages.
Just 7 pages. And it became an underground sensation. It was photocopied and passed around every major studio in town.
Yeah.
It was incredibly influential. However, a prominent film critic for the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner acquired a copy and wrote a scathing, highly publicized piece attacking it.
Oh no.
Yeah. This critic blamed Vogler's 7-page memo for essentially corrupting the soul of Hollywood storytelling. He pointed to massive box office flops of the era like Howard the Duck and Ishtar.
Oof. Yeah, those are notorious.
Right. And he claimed that lazy studio executives were using Vogler's formula as a cookie cutter, stuffing it down the throats of brilliant original writers and ruining their art.
I mean, if I am a young executive trying to build a career and a major Los Angeles film critic publicly blames me for the destruction of modern cinema, my first instinct is absolute existential panic.
Naturally.
Or I'm like calling a lawyer and challenging this guy to a public screaming match.
And Vogler admits he felt exactly that initial wave of devastation and defensive anger. He felt like his career was being shot down before it had even truly begun.
Understand?
But then, rather than reacting purely on emotion, he applied his own mythic framework to the reality of his situation. He took a step back and recognized that this critic wasn't just an angry guy with a typewriter. He was perfectly embodying a classic archetype from the hero's journey.
Oh, this is so good.
The critic was acting as a threshold guardian.
Right. A psychological force that magically appears to block the door just as the hero is attempting to cross into a new, more advanced phase of life.
Exactly. And the ancient mythological rule for dealing with a threshold guardian is deeply counterintuitive. The instinct is to draw your sword and attack them head-on.
Which is what most of us would do.
Yeah, but mythology teaches us that if you attack a threshold guardian directly, you almost always lose, because you are fighting on their terms. You're playing right into their strength.
So what's the alternative?
The true path past a guardian is to understand them, outwit them, or ideally absorb their energy and convert them from an enemy into an ally.
So what did Vogler do?
Utilizing this exact mythic blueprint, he suppressed his hostility. Instead of writing an angry rebuttal, he reached out to the critic and invited him to co-host a massive panel discussion at a UCLA film seminar.
Wait, he essentially invites his attacker onto his own stage, handing him a microphone.
He brought the danger directly into his own camp.
That is a bold move.
Very bold.
Yeah.
But the critic accepted the invitation, and they engaged in a lively, intense, but ultimately respectful public debate about structure versus intuition. Vogler notes that the seminar was infinitely more engaging, and his own theories grew significantly stronger and more nuanced, precisely because they were being actively challenged by a smart opponent.
Wow.
The critic, who started as a hostile force trying to destroy Vogler's career, became an essential ally in refining the work. The attack morphed into a blessing, proving that this mythological blueprint isn't just a gimmick for organizing a screenplay. It is a highly effective, practical strategy for real-life conflict resolution.
That is incredible. But, stepping into the critic's shoes for a moment, the underlying fear he voiced is entirely valid, and the text spends considerable time addressing it. It is the danger of the cookie cutter.
Right. Formula fear.
Yeah. If this 12-stage structure is truly universal, and if every successful narrative is just a slight variation of this exact same blueprint, aren't we running the terrifying risk of turning all human art into a boring, predictable, algorithmic formula?
Very common criticism.
Because there is a massive inherent tension between an artist who relies on pure, untamed, chaotic intuition and a corporate studio system that demands standardization, safety, and predictability.
And that tension is exactly why Vogler makes a vital, non-negotiable distinction in the text. The hero's journey is a form, not a formula.
Not a formula.
Okay, explain that.
It operates like a standardized language. It's a vital shorthand for communication among the hundreds of people required to make a film. It allows a junior studio executive, a veteran director, an eccentric actor, and a cynical editor to all speak the exact same structural dialect. That makes coordination so much easier.
Exactly. However, if it is treated as a formula, like if a writer lazily imposes these stages, like a rigid paint-by-numbers kit, without doing the grueling, agonizing work of digging into the character's unique psychology,
Right.
it instantly becomes a stifling, predictable cliché. The map is meant to be a flexible reference point, a source of inspiration when you're lost in the woods, not a dictatorial mandate that crushes the organic life out of the story.
Okay, even if we accept it as a flexible form, we have to acknowledge that this specific framework has been aggressively popularized and codified by the American Hollywood system.
No, without a doubt.
Doesn't that risk a dangerous kind of cultural imperialism? Like if massive Western studios export this very specific brand of storytelling, where every loose end ties up neatly, where the rugged individual always triumphs over the collective, and where the hero is always a righteous, conquering victor, aren't we just smothering the complex, unique, and deeply varied storytelling traditions of the rest of the world?
That's a great point, and Vogler actually confronted this exact issue during his extensive international travels while teaching these concepts. He discovered very quickly that the Hollywood interpretation of a hero's journey carries heavy, very specific Western biases.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Hollywood assumes that individual effort is the highest possible virtue, and that conclusive happy endings are practically a human right. But when you step outside of North America, other cultures process the concept of the journey, and especially the concept of the hero, in radically different ways.
And I want to push back on that term hero, because the text points out that in several cultures, labeling someone a hero isn't a compliment. It is met with intense historical suspicion.
It's true. And just to be clear, we are neutrally reporting on the historical concepts presented in the text here, not taking any political sides. But the text details two fascinating historical examples of what we can broadly categorize as herophobic cultures, where the traditional chest-thumping savior is viewed with deep distrust.
Okay, let's look at those.
The first example the text explores is Australia. Yeah, Australian cultural history has bred a deep skepticism toward the traditional gung-ho heroic figure. Part of this stems from their history, where grand appeals to heroic virtue and glory historically lured generations of young Australian men into dying in foreign conflicts, fighting Britain's wars.
So there is real historical trauma there associated with the word hero.
Exactly. And this bred what is culturally known as the tall poppy syndrome. It's the idea that any poppy in the field that grows taller than the rest, anyone who aggressively seeks the limelight or acts morally superior, needs to be cut down to size.
So if the culture rejects the shining knight, what does an acceptable Australian hero actually look like?
According to the text, a character like the protagonist of Mad Max represents the quintessential Australian archetype.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Right. He is deeply reluctant, highly self-effacing, and he expends a massive amount of energy trying to avoid accepting responsibility for anyone other than himself for as long as humanly possible.
He just wants to be left alone.
Yes, he only acts when all other options are entirely exhausted.
Fascinating. And the text also delves into Germany's profound post-WWII herophobia, which carries an even heavier historical weight.
Yes, the text explains that Germany historically possessed a rich, deep tradition of venerating the romantic hero in their myths and opera.
Like Wagner and all that.
Exactly. However, the catastrophic legacy of 2 world wars, and specifically the manipulation of those myths by Nazism, severely tainted the entire concept. The passionate, romantic, absolute symbols of the hero myth were warped by German militarism to demand blind obedience, leading to enslavement and destruction.
Right.
Because of that immense historical trauma, the text states that post-WWII German culture developed a profound ambivalence toward the romantic hero. A shining savior claiming absolute moral authority is, frankly, terrifying to them.
That is completely understandable given the history.
Right. Therefore, their culture shows a strong preference for unsentimental realism. Dispassionate, cold-blooded, highly pragmatic anti-heroes who operate in shades of gray are much more aligned with their modern cultural spirit than a traditional, unwavering knight.
Again, we have to maintain an impartial view of these historical contexts, but it proves that the lens through which we view a story is deeply colored by where we are standing.
Absolutely.
And that lens isn't just geographical or historical, it is heavily influenced by gender, too. One of the most persistent criticisms of the hero's journey is that it is fundamentally a masculine, warrior-centric blueprint.
Yes, that criticism comes up a lot.
It focuses almost entirely on thrusting outward, conquering external enemies, violently penetrating the unknown, and bringing back a prize. Does this aggressive, linear model accurately map the female experience?
The text acknowledges that this criticism is entirely valid. The traditional, culturally dominant model of the journey is extremely linear. It's a straight, unbroken line from point A to point B to conquer an external physical goal.
Very goal-oriented.
Yeah. The text suggests that the female journey, or really any narrative focused on internal emotional integration rather than external conquest, might be better visualized not as a straight line, but as a spiral or a series of concentric rings.
A spiral, okay.
Yeah. Instead of marching outward to slay a dragon, the journey might involve moving deeply inward toward the center of the self, grappling with complex emotional webs, coming to terms with internal contradictions, focusing on the preservation of the family or the species,
And then what?
and then expanding that healed energy back outward in widening circles rather than simply standing on top of the mountain.
The visual of the spiral makes the journey feel infinitely more dynamic and internally focused.
It really does.
And speaking of altering the visual map, Vogler offers another brilliant alternative to the standard, unbroken, circular drawing of the journey, the baseball diamond model.
Oh, the baseball diamond model is brilliant. It radically changes our perception of how a hero's immediate goals shift during the course of a narrative.
Okay, break that down for us.
If you take the smooth curves of the traditional circular journey and straighten them out into a diamond, you create a shape defined by sharp 90-degree turns. Each face on that diamond represents a major act climax, a massive, unavoidable turning point where the hero's current direction drastically and violently shifts.
Okay, let's track a character running those faces.
Sure.
So the hero steps up to the plate, hits the ball, and sprints toward first base. During this initial sprint, which is Act 1, their goal is clear and usually superficial. Let's say they are desperately seeking a physical treasure.
Right, they just want the goal.
But the moment their foot hits first base, they hit a 90-degree turn. The world changes, and suddenly the treasure doesn't matter, they are running toward second base, and now their entire motivation has shifted to pursuing a romantic love interest they just met.
A complete pivot.
Exactly. Then they round second base, which represents the massive midpoint ordeal, and the goal aggressively shifts again. Love is forgotten because the villain has trapped them. So the run toward third base is purely about trying to escape with their life.
Survival mode.
Yes. They hit third base, a tragedy strikes, and the final desperate sprint toward home plate isn't about treasure or love or even escape. It is about pure, unadulterated revenge.
The superficial, immediate goals change abruptly at every single base, creating dynamic tension. But the ultimate, overarching psychological goal, for instance, the character learning true self-reliance, remains the constant underlying engine driving the entire run around the diamond.
That is amazing. It proves how incredibly adaptable the form is when you stop looking at it as a rigid circle.
Exactly.
So we have established the immense flexibility of the form, cultural nuances, and the shifting shape of the map itself. Now let's actually walk the path. We need to explore the 12 stages of the hero's journey, not as a mechanical checklist of plot points, but as a logical evolution of human growth.
Let's do it.
We start with Act 1, Departure. The very first psychological baseline is the ordinary world.
Right, the ordinary world is the required foundation. Because before you can derive any meaning from showing a fish flopping around out of water, you first have to show the audience the fish swimming in the water.
That makes sense.
You must establish the mundane, boring, or deeply unstable everyday life of the hero. This establishes the character's baseline neuroses and creates a stark, necessary contrast with the bizarre, special world they're about to enter.
You see this beautifully in The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy isn't just in a boring place. She is trapped in a drab, sepia-toned, black and white Kansas.
Exactly.
It is visually suppressing her spirit. It's her baseline, but it is deeply unsatisfying.
And the seeds of the hero's ultimate destruction or salvation are always present in that ordinary world. But, the hero will never leave voluntarily. They require a disruption, which brings us to the call to adventure.
Stage 2.
Yes. The hero is suddenly presented with a challenge, a profound problem, or a quest. The status quo is shattered, and they realize they can no longer stay indefinitely in the suffocating comfort of their baseline reality.
This is the iconic moment Princess Leia's hologram violently flickers to life out of R2-D2, declaring, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only
A perfect example.
hope." The balance of the entire universe is broken, and a simple farm boy named Luke Skywalker is being called upon to fix it. But human nature dictates that Luke doesn't just grab his coat and jump on a spaceship. The immediate human reaction to massive change is paralysis, which triggers the refusal of the call.
And the refusal is arguably the most relatable psychological stage. It is entirely driven by fear.
Right.
The hero faces the absolute greatest of all human terrors, which is the terror of the completely unknown. They balk at the threshold, they make excuses.
Like Luke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In Star Wars, Luke initially rejects Obi-Wan's fall outright. He rationalizes his fear, claiming he has chores to do, he has to stay on his uncle's moisture farm, it's not his fight.
We've all been there.
Psychologically, we all do this when offered a new job or daunting relationship. We cling to the misery we know rather than face the void we don't.
So what pushes him over the edge?
Luke only fully commits after he returns home to find his aunt and uncle brutally murdered by stormtroopers. The abstract evil of the Empire suddenly becomes deeply, painfully personal, and his reluctance vanishes because the ordinary world has been literally burned to the ground.
Wow. Once the hero realizes they must go, they face the reality that they are completely unequipped for the journey. This introduces the mentor. And I have to ask, why do we constantly seek out these elder figures before making a major life change?
We seek the mentor because we require validation and preparation to face the void. The mentor figure provides the hero with supplies, magical artifacts, or crucial psychological wisdom.
Like Glinda?
This is Glinda the Good Witch appearing to Dorothy to bestow the ruby slippers.
Yeah.
This is Obi-Wan Kenobi handing Luke his father's lightsaber. The mentor acts as a bridge, giving the hero the bare minimum tools required to survive.
But they can't do it for them.
No. But the mentor cannot take the journey for them. Eventually, the elder must step back, forcing the hero to cross into the unknown completely alone.
Which brings us to crossing the first threshold. This is the psychological point of no return.
Yes. This stage marks the definitive turning point between Act 1 and Act 2. The hero definitively commits to the adventure. The balloon goes up, the ship sails out of the harbor.
Okay, give me a movie example.
Think of the moment Axel Foley in Beverly Hills Cop consciously decides to defy his boss's direct orders, packing his bags and leaving the familiar, gritty, working-class streets of Detroit to investigate his friend's murder in the wealthy, sun-drenched, completely alien landscape of Beverly Hills.
He has stepped over the line.
He cannot uncross it.
And once that line is crossed, we are thrust into Act 2, initiation. The hero has arrived in the special world, but they have absolutely no idea how it operates. They have to endure tests, allies, and enemies. They have to sort out the rules of this new reality. And it is fascinating how often this specific sorting process takes place in a bar.
Oh, it's a recurring mythological trope for a very practical reason. Saloons, seedy dive bars, and space cantinas are the classic watering holes.
Watering holes, right?
They are places where all strata of society mingle, making them the perfect proving ground for a new arrival. It is the Mos Eisley Cantina in Star Wars. Within 5 minutes of walking into that dark, dangerous room, Luke learns that the special world operates on sudden, lethal violence. He forms a necessary but shady alliance with Han Solo, and he inadvertently makes deadly enemies of Jabba the Hutt's associates.
The watering hole acts as a microcosm of the entire special world.
Exactly.
Once the hero has gathered their ragtag crew and understands the rules, they enter the approach to the stage. They're no longer wandering, they are purposefully pausing at the very gates of the villain's headquarters, taking a deep breath and gathering their courage to plan their assault.
And the approach is the necessary deep breath before the plunge, because what follows is the absolute centerpiece of the mythology, which is the ordeal.
The big one.
This is the midpoint of the story, the supreme life-or-death crisis. The hero hits absolute rock bottom in a direct, terrifying confrontation with her greatest physical or psychological fear.
Think of our heroes trapped in the trash compactor in Star Wars. The walls are literally physically closing in to crush them to death, and Luke is violently pulled underwater by an unseen monster. As an audience, we genuinely believe for a fraction of a second that the hero might actually die in the dark.
And the psychological mechanics of the ordeal are vital to understand. Why does an audience need to see the hero suffer so profoundly? Why do we require them to almost die?
Yeah, why is that?
It operates exactly like the mechanics of a massive amusement park roller coaster. To achieve a state of elation, the audience must first experience the absolute terror of impending doom. Your emotions must be deliberately depressed to the lowest possible point, the brink of death, so that when the hero miraculously survives, you feel an immense, explosive physiological elation.
Like the wisdom of the body again.
Yes. Think of the scene where the alien in E.T. actually dies on the sterile operating table. The audience is emotionally devastated, children are weeping. So when his heart light suddenly glows red again, the wave of relief is utterly euphoric.
That is so powerful.
The hero must die, or symbolically appear to die, so they can be born again, completely cleansed of their old fears.
And because they endured that ego death and survived, they earn the reward, often called seizing the sword. The hero finally gains the physical treasure, the magical elixir, or the crucial piece of knowledge they came for. Like Luke finally secures the Death Star plans. Dorothy survives the witch's castle and seizes the Wicked Witch's broomstick.
Right. The hero has the prize, but the mythology warns us that the danger is far from over. Snatching the prize wakes the dragon.
Oh.
So we enter Act 3, return, starting with the road back. The hero realizes they must leave the special world, but the dark forces are absolutely furious that their treasure has been stolen.
This psychological backlash produces the greatest chase scenes in cinema.
Oh, absolutely.
It is Elliot and E.T. furiously pedaling their bicycles through the suburbs, desperately fleeing from a massive fleet of government agents. The hero is sprinting for the safety of the ordinary world.
But before they can safely cross back over the threshold and settle down, they must face the resurrection.
Wait, resurrection? We already had the ordeal.
I know, but in ancient tribal cultures, hunters or warriors returning from a brutal campaign had to be ritually purified before re-entering their village, because they literally and spiritually had blood on their hands.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So in narrative terms, the resurrection is a final, brutal exam. It is a second life or death moment, almost a replay of the midpoint ordeal, designed to test if the hero has truly, permanently absorbed the lessons they learned. Death gets one last, desperate, terrifying shot at the hero.
A perfect cinematic example is Zach Mayo in An Officer and a Gentleman. He has survived the training, but before he can graduate, he has to endure a final, brutal, almost lethal fistfight with his drill instructor. He has to survive that final, agonizing crucible to prove to himself and the audience that his internal transformation from a selfish loner to a man of honor is permanent.
Exactly. And once that final exam is passed, we reach the conclusion. Return with the elixir. The hero finally steps back into the ordinary world, but they are forever changed. They bring back healing, a literal treasure, or the emotional boon that will benefit their broader community. because the entire grueling journey is ultimately meaningless unless something of profound value is brought back to heal the sickness of the starting place.
So, what does this all mean for us as consumers or creators of these stories? Like, are we saying that every single valid story ever told has to march mechanically through this exact 12-step order, like an unyielding checklist?
Absolutely not. Vogler is adamant that treating this map as a rigid sequence destroys the art. These stages can be heavily shuffled, entirely deleted, or infinitely repeated without losing any of their psychological magic.
Good, because otherwise it would get so boring.
Right. A story might start in media res, opening directly at the approach to the inmost cave, completely skipping the ordinary world. Or a deeply traumatized hero might have to endure 3 distinct, grueling ordeals before they finally learn their lesson.
The form, not the formula.
Exactly. The framework is merely the skeletal structure. The individual, unique details of the story provide the flesh and blood.
Okay, so we have mapped the terrain of the journey, but a map is entirely useless without its travelers. We need to transition from the geography of the story to the cast of characters, the archetypes. Now, you mentioned earlier that these aren't just rigid character roles or job descriptions.
No, they're not. To understand archetypes, Vogler leans heavily on the work of the Russian formalist scholar Vladimir Prop.
Okay.
Prop established that archetypes are not strict, permanent identities.
Right.
Rather, they are temporary masks that characters wear to perform a specific function and advance the narrative.
Masks. I like that.
Yeah, so a single character might enter the story wearing the mask of a herald, switch in the second act being a trickster, and eventually tragically don the mask of the shadow.
It's fluid.
Very fluid.
Yeah.
More profoundly, in Jungian terms, these archetypal masks represent the fragmented facets of the heroes, and by extension, the audience's own complex personality.
Let's start by unpacking the central figure, the hero. I get why we naturally gravitate toward heroes, but if we look at this psychologically, if the hero merely represents the ego, doesn't that make the entire concept fundamentally selfish? Like, how does an inherently selfish archetype end up building or saving a community?
It's a brilliant question, because the journey of the hero is actually a trajectory from selfishness to selflessness.
Oh, interesting.
Psychologically, the hero represents the ego, that newly formed part of the personality that aggressively separates from the mother or the collector tribe, and boldly considers itself distinct and unique. The initial departure is entirely about the ego's selfish search for personal identity.
Right.
However, dramatically, the true mark of a fully realized hero isn't just bravery or martial skill. It is their ultimate willingness to engage in sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
Yes. The root of the word sacrifice means making holy. The selfish ego must eventually be willing to give up something of immense personal value, even his own life, for the preservation of the broader group.
And the text outlines that heroes come in a multitude of conflicting flavors, right? Like, you have anti-heroes who can be deeply wounded, cynical outcasts like the classic Humphrey Bogart characters, or tragic doomed figures brought down entirely by their own unyielding flaws like Tony Montana and Scarface.
Oh, absolutely.
You have group-oriented heroes who fight solely for the right to return to their tribe, and you have loner heroes like John Wayne's character in The Searchers who do the bloody work but are forever isolated, unable to re-enter civilized society.
And then the text introduces a highly unique variation that challenges the standard rules of the catalyst hero.
Okay, this is exactly what I was thinking about when we mentioned Eddie Murphy playing Axel Foley in Beverly Hills Cop. Because if the entire fundamental point of the hero's journey is that the character must endure trials in order to internally grow and change, why doesn't Axel Foley change at all?
Right.
He starts the film as a fast-talking, rebellious, anti-authoritarian cop, and he ends the movie with the exact same personality.
And that is because Axel Foley perfectly defines the catalyst hero. They are the deliberate exception to the rule of internal transformation.
Oh, so they don't have to change.
No, a catalyst hero remains internally static. Their core personality does not shift. Instead, their primary dramatic function is to act as an unstoppable force of nature that brings about massive, unavoidable transformation in everyone around them.
I see.
Axel Foley doesn't need to change his worldview, but his chaotic presence forces his rigid, straight-laced Beverly Hills counterparts, detectives Taggart and Rosewood, to completely dismantle their own beliefs and transform into better, more adaptable cops. The change still happens, it is just externalized.
That reframing makes so much sense of characters like James Bond or Superman. Okay, moving to the next mask, the mentor. The classic wise old man or woman.
Psychologically, the mentor represents the higher self. It's the God within acting as a profound internal conscience. Think of a much more serious version of Jiminy Cricket.
Always whispering in your ear.
Exactly. Dramatically, their function is to guide, to motivate, and to bestow gifts upon the hero.
But those gifts are never free. The mythology is very clear that a mentor doesn't just hand a lazy hero a magic sword. The gift must be earned.
Always.
Like Daedalus gives the hero the magic thread required to navigate and escape the labyrinth, but only because the hero proved their worthiness through prior action.
Precisely. The universe does not reward the passive. And it is crucial to note that mentors are not always perfect, glowing figures of absolute morality. The text explores dark mentors who wear the mask of wisdom but act as deliberate decoys to lure a naive hero into fatal danger.
Wow.
And there are also fallen mentors who are experiencing a profound crisis of faith. Think of Tom Hanks' character in A League of Their Own. He is a former baseball hero, completely sidelined by injury and alcoholism. He has fallen from grace, and the emotional hook is that the audience is desperately rooting for him to pull himself out of the gutter so he can finally step up and help the heroes achieve their goal.
We have our hero and our mentor. But if they just sit in a room agreeing with each other, you don't have a story, you have a therapy session. They require massive, unyielding friction. They need deception and conflict to generate momentum. This leads us to the forces of change and shadow. Let's examine the Threshold Guardian. I have always thought of the Threshold Guardian as a massive, intimidating bouncer standing at the velvet ropes of the nightclub of your own ultimate potential.
The bouncer analogy is perfect.
Yeah.
Psychologically, threshold guardians represent our own deeply ingrained internal neuroses, our unhealed emotional scars, and our self-imposed limitations.
The things holding us back.
Yes, every single time you attempt to make a major positive change in your life, quitting a toxic job, ending a bad relationship, these internal demons violently rise up. Dramatically, they aren't necessarily there to murder you. Their function is to relentlessly test whether you are truly deeply resolved to change, or if you were just playing at it.
And as we discussed with Vogler and the critic, you rarely get past this bouncer by throwing a punch.
No, attacking a guardian head-on usually results in the hero being thrown out of the club. The secret to bypassing them is to get into their skin, understand their motivation.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. In The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy and her friends need to enter the Wicked Witch's heavily guarded castle, they don't draw swords and attempt to slaughter the massive army. They quietly ambush 3 isolated sentries, steal their uniforms, and literally march right through the front gates, wearing the enemy's skin.
That's brilliant.
They bypass the Guardian by absorbing its outward identity.
Next, we have the masks that generate chaos, the Herald and the Trickster.
The Herald is the archetype that delivers the call to adventure. Their sole function is to announce the undeniable need for change. In Shakespeare's Henry V, it is the French herald who arrogantly delivers the insulting gift of tennis balls to the young English king. That single provocative action sparks an entire catastrophic war.
And the Trickster.
The Trickster, conversely, is the embodiment of mischief and comic relief. Their psychological function is to continuously subvert the status quo and aggressively cut massive, inflated egos down to size.
This is Bugs Bunny constantly outsmarting Elmer Fudd, or Loki creating chaos in Norse mythology. They don't necessarily want to destroy the world, they just stir up trouble for the sake of it, forcing stagnant, dead energy to start moving again.
Exactly. They're the enemies of stagnation. Then we arrive at one of the most complex masks, the shapeshifter.
Oh, I like this one.
Psychologically, the shapeshifter represents the anima and animus. These are Carl Jung's specific terms for the deeply repressed male element residing within the female unconscious and the deeply repressed female element residing within the male unconscious.
Let's slow down and really unpack that because it explains so much about real-life human relationships. This is the psychology of projection, right? We have this idealized internal image of the perfect mate, and instead of dealing with reality, we project that mask onto a real, flawed human being. And when they inevitably fail to act exactly like our internal fantasy, we get furious and accuse them of being two-faced or deceptive.
That is exactly how projection operates, and it is the core of the shapeshifter archetype. We force our partners to wear a mask they never asked for.
Wow.
Dramatically, introducing a shapeshifter into a narrative creates profound doubt and intense suspense. This archetype is the origin of the femme fatale, or the homme fatale, in noir thrillers.
Like in Hitchcock movies.
Yes. Think of the dizzying, shifting identities in Hitchcock's Vertigo, or Sharon Stone's character in Basic Instinct. The hero is constantly asking, is this person my devoted lover, or are they secretly plotting to murder me in my sleep? The shapeshifter keeps the hero and the audience entirely off balance.
Which finally brings us to the ultimate source of conflict, the shadow.
And what's fascinating here is that the shadow is not just a guy in a black cape. It represents the deepest, most terrifying recesses of the human psyche.
The dark stuff.
The shadow is composed of all the repressed, unexpressed, or completely rejected aspects of our own personality. All the guilt, the unresolved trauma, the selfish desires, and the monstrous thoughts we hide deep inside ourselves are externalized into the form of the villain.
But if the shadow is just pure, unadulterated evil, it gets boring very quickly, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A villain who is evil purely for the sake of being evil is a cartoon. The most effective, haunting shadows in literature and film are heavily humanized. They are made shockingly vulnerable.
How so?
Well, the legendary novelist Graham Greene was an absolute master of this technique. He would write a scene where the hero is standing in the shadows, gun drawn, fully prepared to assassinate the villain. But right before pulling the trigger, the hero notices the villain is suffering from a miserable head cold, or is gently weeping while reading a letter from a strange dog. In that split second, the monster evaporates, and the hero is forced to look at a frail, flawed human being. Or consider Darth Vader. He spends 2 films as the ultimate, imposing, mechanized shadow, but the supreme climax of the narrative reveals him to be a deeply broken, suffering father. Humanizing the shadow forces the hero's ultimate decision to be a profound, agonizing moral choice, rather than just a mindless, violent reflex.
And to help the hero process all of this, we have the ally, the loyal sidekick. This is Dr. Watson standing next to Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, sir.
They serve a very specific mechanical purpose. They ask the naive questions that the audience is secretly thinking. They run errands and carry messages. And most importantly, they humanize an often aloof hero by giving them a grounded friend to talk to.
Allies provide warmth. They could be humans, loyal animals, ghosts, or helpful servants. They act as the audience's comforting surrogate while navigating the terrifying landscape of the special world.
Okay, so we have outlined the map, and we have deeply examined the psychological masks of the characters walking it. But to truly synthesize all of this, to figure out how to pull this out of the realm of movies and actively apply it to your own life, we need to execute a deep zoom on the very beginning of the journey.
Right, the setup.
We are going to look closely at stages 1 and 2, the ordinary world and the call. Because that delicate, precarious time right before the threshold is crossed is exactly where most of us get entirely stuck in our own lives.
It's true. And the narrative burden placed on the opening scenes of any story is absolutely immense. As a writer, you have to instantly hook the audience's attention, clearly establish the underlying thematic question of the work, and smoothly dole out necessary backstory.
Which is hard to do naturally.
Very hard.
Yeah.
You must do all of this without resorting to a Harry the Explainer character. You know, someone who just awkwardly walks onto the screen and clumsily dumps a heavy load of exposition onto the audience's lap.
You have to be infinitely more clever. You have to utilize structural foreshadowing. One of my absolute favorite cinematic examples of doing this perfectly is the opening sequence of Romancing the Stone.
Oh, it is widely considered a masterclass in how to open a film efficiently.
It really is. The very first thing the audience sees on screen is this wild, stylized, completely over-the-top fantasy. A noble, beautiful heroine is violently fighting off sleazy villains and riding off into the sunset with a rugged, idealized hero.
It's totally absurd.
But then, the camera slowly pulls back and the illusion shatters. You realize you are not watching reality. You are just seeing the dramatic conclusion of a trashy romance novel being typed out by the protagonist, Joan Wilder, while she sits alone in her cluttered, lonely New York apartment weeping at her own words.
Such a great reveal.
In 2 minutes, it tells you everything you need to know about her deeply unrealistic, sheltered notions of love and danger. But crucially, that opening fantasy perfectly models the very real, highly lethal world she is about to stumble into when she travels to Colombia.
Exactly. It establishes her baseline neuroses and foreshadows the entire plot simultaneously, and it ties directly into the crucial concept of how a character makes their entrance.
Right.
A character's very first action on screen should definitively establish their core identity. When Mark Twain introduces us to Tom Sawyer, we don't first see him just casually walking down the street.
Yeah.
Our first impression is watching him brilliantly, manipulatively conning his friend into whitewashing a fence for him while he sits back and watches. That single, defining action tells you absolutely everything you need to know about his attitude, his intelligence, and how he will behave for the rest of the film.
Which leads us to a crucial element in character design. Here's where it gets really interesting. Why do we instinctively prefer our heroes to be broken? Why do we demand that they carry massive flaws and deep unhealed wounds?
Well, we demand it because absolute perfection is incredibly alienating and deeply boring.
Yeah.
We, as flawed human beings, cannot relate to a perfect, untroubled God. The Greek philosopher Aristotle identified this necessity thousands of years ago, calling it the hamartia. The tragic flaw, like blinding hubris or arrogance, that puts a seemingly great hero at odds with their own destiny. But in modern storytelling, heroes often bear a much more visceral, literal, or psychological wound.
A perfect example is Mel Gibson's character, Martin Riggs, in the original Lethal Weapon. When we meet him, he isn't just a tough cop. He is a grieving widower who is actively, dangerously suicidal.
That is a massive wound.
A massive, gaping psychological wound that dictates his every reckless action.
Or examine the deeply traumatized men in Terry Gilliam's The Fisher King. Their profound physical and mental traumas are not just character quirks. They act as a symbol for a dying, sick society that desperately needs to be healed. That unhealed wound is what creates a vacuum, a profound sense of lack in the hero's life. Yes, if the hero is perfectly content, they will never leave the couch. The wound creates the agonizing friction that literally drives the quest for wholeness. The entire 12-stage journey is, at its core, a desperate attempt to find the medicine required to heal that specific wound.
And what specific event triggers that frantic search for medicine? It is stage 2, the call to adventure. And the primary emotion associated with the call is profound disorientation.
It is vital to understand that the call isn't always a glorious trumpet sounding from the heavens, inviting you to greatness.
Right.
Sometimes the call is simply the terrifying realization that you have completely run out of options. Look at the comedy Sister Act. Whoopi Goldberg's character doesn't receive a noble calling. She witnesses a mob murder and is forced to hide in a convent or be violently executed. The call can be an eviction notice, a medical diagnosis, or a sudden betrayal.
Regardless of how it arrives, it throws a hero's entire worldview completely off balance.
There is a brilliant, purely visual representation of this profound disorientation in Alfred Hitchcock's espionage thriller, Notorious. Cary Grant plays a ruthless American intelligence agent, tasked with recruiting Ingrid Bergman's character.
Okay.
When Grant first enters the story, he is wearing the mask of an aloof playboy, a shapeshifter hiding his true motives. But when the time comes to deliver the call to adventure, he assumes the mask of the herald. Bergman's character wakes up incredibly hungover, sick, and vulnerable in her bed.
She's at rock bottom.
Grant stands in her doorway, an imposing silhouette, and practically forces her to drink a bubbly medicinal bromide. It tastes absolutely foul, like poison, but it is exactly the harsh medicine she requires to clear her head.
And to truly convey her internal state, Hitchcock shoots this entire interaction with a wild, completely upside-down camera angle.
Yes. From Bergman's sick, hungover point of view, Cary Grant literally appears to be walking upside down on the ceiling.
That is so cool.
It is a stunning, jarring visual that perfectly captures the profound, sickening disorientation of being forcefully called to change your life. The call to adventure is deeply unsettling. It forces you to look at your entire existence upside down, stripping away your comfort and demanding that you face reality.
That visual is incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pull back and synthesize everything we have explored today. The overarching revelation here is that the hero's journey is categorically not just a cynical algorithm utilized for churning out predictable Hollywood scripts.
Not at all.
It is not a rigid formula that artists should blindly obey. It is a profound, incredibly accurate, historically tested psychological map for navigating the terrifying changes, the agonizing ordeals, and the ultimate rewards of our own human lives.
Exactly.
The archetypes we discussed, the mentor, the guardian, the trickster, the shadow, are not just fictional characters wearing costumes on a movie screen. They are the literal people we interact with in our offices and our homes every single day. More terrifyingly, they represent the conflicting, chaotic emotions warring inside our own heads.
Recognizing those patterns gives you agency. But I want to leave you with a final, slightly different perspective to consider regarding this journey, particularly concerning the modern world we live in.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have spent an hour discussing how the call to adventure is the necessary spark that forces us to grow. But think about the architecture of our modern digital lives. Think about how social media algorithms are explicitly designed.
Oh, interesting.
Their entire function is to map your preferences and feed you a constant, uninterrupted stream of content that keeps you perfectly comfortable, perfectly validated, and entirely sedated in your ordinary world. If the call to adventure relies on disruption, friction, and encountering the unknown, are our highly curated digital feeds systemically blocking us from ever receiving the call? Are we engineering a society where the threshold to the special world is permanently hidden behind an algorithmic wall of comfort?
That is a terrifying and brilliant thought to end on. If the algorithm ensures we never feel the lack, we never embark on the journey. The blueprint for growth is